Welcome everyone from the heartland of America, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. The Rotary Club of Downtown Sioux Falls, in partnership with Midco, is honored to host this forum and issues debate between the two candidates for a U.S. Senate seat representing South Dakota. The Republican two-term incumbent, John Thune, the Democratic challenger, Jay Williams. I'm Jack Marsh, a longtime journalist and retired executive of Gannett, Freedom Forum, and the Newseum. For the next 60 minutes or so, Mr. Thune and Mr. Williams will have a fair opportunity to make their best cases and state their positions on a wide range of issues. The questions are mine and have not been shared in advance. As moderator, I challenge the candidates to talk about themselves, their views, their values, their experiences, and not go negative against their opponents. And I ask all of you here in the Holiday Inn Ballroom to be respectful of the candidates by avoiding applause and outbursts that could detract from the civility and decorum of this debate. The candidates will each have 1 minute to respond to most of the questions. More time may be allotted as warranted. Diane Metley, who is seated down in front, is the official timekeeper, and she will hold up warning signs for the candidates as time runs down and then expires. The seating order and the initial speaking order were determined by a coin toss earlier this afternoon. Mr. Thune will go first, and then about halfway through the debate, the speaking order will be reversed, and Mr. Williams will get the first turn. We begin with two personal questions. Give us some insight into how you perceive yourselves, concisely, with one-word or two-word descriptions if possible. What are the 12 to 15 most important personal traits, qualities, characteristics, and values that define you as a person? And we begin with Mr. Thune.
Well, thank you, Jack, and thanks to Downtown Rotary. I've had the chance to interact with this group a lot over the years, and it's great to be with you again today. 12 to 15 is a lot. I don't know if I can get that many.
We'll take your top 10.
Okay, well, that may be even stretching it. I guess what I would say is I'm just a small-town kid who loves the state. I grew up out in the western part of South Dakota in a little town called Myrtle. When I was growing up, for me, life began and ended at the city limits of the hometown. We didn't have the internet. We didn't get many places very often. But I just greatly value the upbringing I had, the chance to live in a small town, go to a small school, participate in a lot of activities. I got to play football and basketball and run track and play baseball and play tuba in the band and sing in the swing choir and do all the things that you get to do in a small town. So I would say that if I could use just one word, I'm just a small town kid.
Mr. Williams.
Well, I want to echo Senator Thune's comments. Thank you, Jack, for having us, and thank you to the Downtown Rotary. I'm really happy to be here today. I also am a South Dakota boy, a fourth-generation South Dakota boy, raised on a farm up around Gettysburg, South Dakota. You know, I'm a U.S. Navy veteran and a veteran of the Peace Corps, and I've been a businessman for the last 30 years. And I guess I would, kind of think of myself as being really a fair-minded sort of person, an open sort of person. I love people, and I like talking to people. I've been going around the state for the last, 6, 7 months, maybe longer, meeting people, and I really enjoy doing that. So I consider myself to be fairly personable, and I consider myself to be open to ideas. I don't hold any ideas just sacrosanct. I've come to a lot of beliefs over the years, but I'm the kind of guy who would like to hear what you have to say, and based on what you have to say, especially if you can convince me, I'm the kind of guy that will change. So I consider myself not malleable, but open and willing to listen to new ideas, and I look forward to hearing from you guys today.
As a U.S. Senator, you will be dealing with matters of enormous complexity. How do you keep your mind sharp, stay well-informed, and continue to learn? Specifically, please explain your reading and viewing habits. What kinds of books and periodicals do you read? What news sources do you trust? What programs do you watch? And how else do you stay on top of domestic and international developments? Mr. Thune.
Well, in this day and age, and thanks for the question, there are so many sources of information and news out there that you can get can get your news from. I always say that in the morning I try and read the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times so I'll know what both sides are saying. But I think you have to have diverse reading habits. I think you have to have, in terms of the books you read, the things that you watch, you can become a news junkie, and that oftentimes you lose balance. My dad is 97 years old, almost. He lives in Murdo in my hometown, and he has way too much time to watch cable news. And so he watches cable news all the time, and then he calls me up, and he's all worked up, and I'm like, Dad, turn it off. But I think you need balance in life, and I get that with my family. But I think too, Jack, what I would say is you have to be a really good listener. I get a lot of information from listening to people in this state, what's on their hearts and minds, and that shapes a lot of what I do and how I view issues.
Mr. Williams.
Well, most of the reading I do is philosophy, believe it or not. I love philosophy. My dad was a philosophy sort of guy, even though he was a farmer, and he had a large library of philosophy books, and he recommended a lot of them to me, like Reinhold Niebuhr's The Nature and Destiny of Man, and I could name several others. So that's the kind of reading that I do. The kind of television I watch the cable news networks, and I enjoy them, and I watch, I try to watch a lot of news. That's mostly what I watch on television. And when I go to movies, I mostly go to documentaries. The last documentary I saw was a documentary called The 13th, which was about the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. And I recommend it to you all. It's being streamed on Netflix, but that's the kind of things I do. And of course, I do love to talk to people, as I said earlier, and so I get a lot of ideas from debating political and religious and all kinds of issues with people.
The national debt is approaching $20 trillion. It grew by $450 billion last year alone because of deficit spending. Would you and how would you address the budget deficit? Mr. Thune.
Well, it has. The overall debt has doubled in the last 8 years under President Obama, and in a short period of time, we're going to be back to $1 trillion a year deficits added to that debt. So it's only a matter of time before this thing, we're going over a cliff, and if we don't do something about it and do it soon, the country is going to be in huge, huge trouble, and that weighs heavily on me as I think about our kids and our grandkids. But I think that, Jack, what you have to do is 2/3 of all federal spending is what we call mandatory spending. It's entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, those sorts of things. We have to reform those programs to get them on a more sustainable level if we're going to deal with the debt. And so that needs to be job number one of the next president, the next Congress, have the political courage and will to get together and figure out how we're going to address and reform our entitlement programs. And the second component of that is economic growth. We have to start growing our economy. That makes the deficit look a lot smaller by comparison because that means that revenues are going to be up significantly.
Mr. Williams.
Well, that when we talk about the debt, we need to understand how we got here. In 2000, when Republican President Bush took over, he had a $1 billion budget surplus. We were paying the debt down. 8 years later, after tax cuts and 2 wars, he gave President Obama a $1.4 trillion deficit. Now, over the 8 years of President Obama, he's cut that from $1.4 trillion down to about $400 billion, which is still quite a lot, but he's cut it by 2/3. And that's mostly been done with spending cuts. If we want to really address the debt, and by the way, the debt is at 0 interest, so it's not as big an issue as it could be. But if we want to address it, what we need to do is we need to pay for the things that we have. When we agree on spending things, we need to be paid for them. And it's not just spending cuts that fixes things. If President Obama had a little bit of help from the obstructionist and dysfunctional Congress, he would have gotten that down to 0. But here we sit with a $400 billion deficit, and with a few little tax increases, we could solve that.
Well, let's take a deeper look now into federal revenues and expenses, beginning with tax policy. What changes do you favor in the federal tax code and in policies, both for individuals and for corporations? Mr. Thune.
Well, first off, the tax code needs to be reformed, and I know a lot of people in this room deal with it and would agree with that. It needs to be simplified, and it needs to be about growth. And I'm not talking about growing the government. I'm talking about growing the economy. The focus of tax reform ought to be economic growth. We're growing at 1% to 2% a year. The historic average going back to the end of World War II is 3 to 3.5%, and coming out of a recession, it's been 3.7%. So we have sluggish, anemic growth. And a lot of that is because our tax code is completely antiquated, and it penalizes people in this country when they do well. And so we're not competitive in the global marketplace. Lowering the business tax, getting rates down, broadening the tax base, simplifying the tax code, but making it about economic growth. We want to get growth back to that 3 to 3.5%. And then the deficit picture, as I mentioned, looks dramatically smaller by comparison, because for every 1% growth in the economy, it generates $300 billion of additional revenue.
Mr. Williams.
Well, I would agree with Senator Thune that our tax code needs some revision so that multi-billionaires such as Donald Trump can take billion-dollar losses and not pay taxes at all. So we do need that kind of reform. But, you know, tax cuts is something that's been tried by the Republicans ever since the 1940s. And if you look at the Treasury Department statistics, every time we have a tax cut, we have less revenue, as you might expect. So tax cuts really aren't the answer. The answer are we need to do really fair tax so that people at the upper end, the 1% that have all the money, pay just like the rest of us hardworking Americans. So with a little bit of tax increases at the upper end, we can pay for our deficit and start bringing the debt down. And that's the real problem we have, is that the Republicans strictly want to cut taxes. And when we cut taxes, we get things like the sequester, which cut across the board 10% taxes, would hurt everybody. We need to be smarter about that. And in order to do that, well, maybe we'll talk about it later.
Mr. Thune, you mentioned that 2/3 of the federal budget goes for entitlements, I think also for paying interest on the debt.
Correct.
And those entitlements would include Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, so forth. What, if any changes, would you make in the funding of those entitlements through increased payroll taxes, changes in payment and benefit payments, and changes in benefit eligibility?
Well, I think that I don't think that you can tax your way out of this problem. I think that when you raise taxes, what you do is you slow down the economy, and what we need is faster growth. You get faster growth, you got more people working, you got more people paying payroll taxes. That's how you solve this in the long term. But if you look at specific suggestions for Social Security and Medicare, one thing that's been talked about, and it doesn't impact anybody who's retired today or anybody who's nearing retirement age, and that is we could gradually phase in an increase in the retirement age for younger workers. So if you're not retired, or if you're 55 and older, you wouldn't be affected by that. But for Medicare and Social Security, we got people who are living longer, more productive lives, and to me that would be a way of dramatically extending the lifespan of those programs. I think with respect to Medicaid, I would like to see more of Medicaid shifted to the states. I think the states could design and customize programs that make sense for individual states, and you'd get a lot more efficient, effective, and accountable program. People trust their state governments. They don't trust the federal government.
Mr. Williams.
Well, there's some fundamental disagreements that Senator Thune and I have on this. First of all, for Social Security, a real easy fix for Social Security is just to take the artificial cap off the payroll tax. Right now, the payroll tax is capped at about $120,000. So the people that pay the payroll tax are the hard-working South Dakotans that make $50,000 to $60,000. If you make $250,000, you only pay payroll tax up to $120,000, and after that, you don't pay any payroll tax. Well, if we took that off, we could fund Social Security on into the future. And Senator Thune says, well, we should raise the age for Social Security. Well, that's because Senator Thune, like me, have never worked in a really a manual labor type job. If you've spent your entire life, out there swinging a hammer and working hard, carrying things around, by the time you get to be 62, your back's about 85. So raising the age of Social Security, I don't think is a good thing for the regular hardworking people, the manual laborers. So I'm not in favor of that. We can fix that Social Security just by making everybody pay their fair share.
With 2/3 of the budget going for entitlements and paying interest on the debt, that of course leaves a third that the Congress really has any discretionary authority over from year to year. In broad terms, where is the federal government spending too much money, and where is the federal government spending too little money? Mr. Thune.
Well, at the moment, and of that third that's left, and you back out all the entitlement programs and mandatory spending and interest on the debt, you have about a third of the pie left. And 1/2 of that, or 1/6 of the total budget, is defense and the military. And frankly, right now, we've got to rebuild our military. I'd like to see us spending at 4% of GDP on our military. We live in an increasingly dangerous world. America needs to be prepared to respond. America has to assert leadership all over the world, and we are dramatically, in my view, underfunding American military today. And you can talk to any of the service chiefs, any of the, anybody you talk to in the military today, and they'll tell you the same thing. In terms of other places you could find savings, I think we have a huge bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. I mean, how about putting a hiring freeze on that bureaucracy? We have agencies that are proliferating regulations that are driving up the cost of doing business in this country, making it more difficult and more expensive to create jobs and grow this economy. And I could start naming names, but I'm out of time.
Mr. Williams.
Well, there are a lot of things we can do about that last third spending. One of the things we can do is look for the waste and fraud that exists in our government. Like right here in South Dakota, our EB-5 program and our Gear Up program were rife with fraud, it looks like. And our federal representatives should be paying more attention to the federal funds that come to our states and make sure that there's no waste and fraud in them. And in terms of the military, we have the strongest and best military in the history of the world. And to put more money in it now is not really a good idea. In fact, our military doesn't really even have the means to be audited. Shockingly, $6.5 trillion of Army expenditures the Pentagon cannot account for. Now, that doesn't mean it's being stolen. It just means that they don't have a way to do an audit of the military. And that's really what we should be doing. We should be auditing that huge military spending to make sure that there's not a lot of fraud and waste. I'm a military veteran, and I can tell you that there are things that are wasted in our government, in our federal budget in terms of the military. And I think that's one place we could look and look hard.
How would your proposals for taxation for federal spending and any changes in government regulation, how would they help ignite our relatively stagnant economy, create jobs, and promote prosperity? Mr. Thune.
It doesn't matter where I go in South Dakota, and I go all over. Small towns, big towns, farms, ranches, small businesses, healthcare, financial services. The thing I hear the most is the cost of federal regulation is like a big wet blanket on this economy. It's costing us more and more every day to comply with regulations. So lessening the regulatory avalanche is huge. There were 600 what they call major new regulations in the last 8 years, and a major regulation is defined as a regulation of $100 million a year economic impact or more. 600 new federal regulations. I think we ought to have a process, and if you create a new one, you ought to be one in, one out. We ought to get rid of regulations if we're going to create new regulations. And frankly, we ought to require Congress to vote on every new major regulation. In other words, every regulation has a $100 million impact on the economy or more, because the cumulative effect of that over the last 8 years is about $1 trillion or $2,000 per family in this country.
Mr. Williams.
Well, Senator Thune talks about regulations, and we should all understand what regulations are. Regulations are the way the administrative branch of the government carries out the laws that are passed by the legislative part of the government. So without laws, there wouldn't be regulations. So when Congress passed laws, we're going to have regulations. And those regulations don't just happen by accident. There's a lot of time and energy, and everybody gets to hear their say before they go into effect. But if we really want to grow the economy, what we need to do is use the federal government to use infrastructure projects, like the kind of project we need to use the clean energy that we have right here in South Dakota. In South Dakota, we got a lot of wind, but we can't harness that wind power and pass it all over the country because we don't have the infrastructure. If we'd spend some federal money on infrastructure, we could grow the economy, create new jobs, and we would have a much better world and a cleaner world. And that's something we have to do, this clean energy. We have to move from fossil fuels to clean energy immediately. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when.
Please elaborate on your platform regarding U.S. foreign policy and international security, specifically as it relates to the Middle East, the threat from ISIS, and the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere. Mr. Thune.
Well, there are so many missteps along the way in the last 8 years. The premature withdrawal from Iraq, not enforcing the red line in Syria, agreeing to a bad Iranian nuclear agreement, that it's put us in a place where we just flat don't have good options. But what I would tell you is I think that in order to defeat ISIS, which is a very immediate threat not only to that region but to the entire world, as we've seen here in the United States, we have to take the fight to them. And there is a fight going on right now led by coalition partners, Iraqis, Kurdish Peshmerga forces, and hopefully they'll be successful. But then we've got to defend the homeland. We have to make sure that we're vetting people who come into this country if we're going to protect our country against a potential terrorist attack. And that means that we've got to have more aviation security measures, something I've worked with as chairman of the Senate Commerce Committee. That means that we have to give our intelligence community the tools that they need to find these people, to root them out if there are lone wolf actors or sleeper cells in this country. That's what it's going to take to defeat this enemy.
Mr. Williams.
Well, you know, there have been several missteps in the Middle East, but those missteps actually began with President George W. Bush, who decided it was important to use our military to invade Iraq. Now, that was at a time when Iraq, of course, they had a bad dictator there, but that guy couldn't do anything. He couldn't even fly his own airplanes. We had him totally contained. But the Republican president decided he should invade that country, and by golly, our military did it. They went through there like a knife through butter. After that, though, more mistakes. You know, the government or the administration decided to use its own people instead of using Iraqis to rebuild Iraq. And as a result, we have the mess we have in the Middle East. So we do have to address it. We have to address what's going on in the Middle East, and we're doing a great job of it right now. We're working with coalition partners. We're providing air cover. We're providing drone strikes. And we're doing a lot of good things. And as a matter of fact, ISIS is being pushed back. And of course, we already took care of al-Qaeda. It was President Obama who did get Osama bin Laden. So we're doing the right things, and I think we need to continue.
Mr. Thune, you brought up military spending. Let's take a closer look at that. What is a sufficient level of military spending in order to ensure we have the proper strength and readiness for our military forces?
Well, I'd say a good benchmark historically, I think, is 4% of GDP. Listen, folks, if you can't defend the country, if you don't get national security right, the rest is conversation. And we face threats not just in the Middle East today. Iran is on the verge of acquiring a nuclear capability. Russia is increasingly aggressive. They went into Ukraine. They annexed Crimea. China is increasingly provocative in the South China Sea. Asia is, if you look over the horizon and the threat matrix that we face in the future, is going to be a very serious threat. There are threats all over the world. The world is in a dangerous place. I hope it doesn't happen, but the United States has to be prepared to be able to project power in multiple areas if necessary at any given time. And American leadership is essential. The world looks to us to lead. And if we don't have the military capability to be able to lead, we're not going to be the leaders that the world needs. And so national security is a critical issue. Military readiness is a critical issue, especially now when we live in an increasingly dangerous world.
Mr. Williams, what's your assessment of military spending?
Well, you know, I am a veteran, so I watch the Navy pretty close. And you know, we have the most powerful military in the history of the world. Just our Navy, we have 11 carrier attack groups. 3 of them right now are deployed around the world. 3 of them are on the way to relieve them, and the other 5 are in R&R, preparing to go back out. So we don't really need to increase our military spending because we have this very strong military right now. Unfortunately, a lot of our military spending has gone for weapon systems that aren't necessarily useful weapon systems, and they're wasteful. So I think that just arbitrarily increasing military spending is not a good idea. We do, however, live in a dangerous world. And so we have to spend our resources on things like, you know, our CIA and our undercover guys who are going out and finding out what's going on in the world. We can't send an aircraft carrier into the middle of Syria. We do have planes we could send in there, but you know, our military is plenty strong enough to defend us.
You both agree this is a dangerous world. How worried are you about the increase and the spread of nuclear weapons?
Well, very worried. And, you know, that's why I say we have to modernize our nuclear capability. You know, the triad, a lot of our nuclear weapons delivery systems, we need the next generation bomber, which hopefully will be bed down at Ellsworth Air Force Base. They're currently working on that today in the developmental stage. But, you know, if we're going to stay ahead of our adversaries, we have to be prepared to use that nuclear capability as a deterrent. And it has to be a believable deterrent. And so I am worried about a rogue nation like in Iran acquiring a nuclear capability, which they are on the path to have, and then that creating nuclear proliferation in the Middle East. Because if Iran has one, the Saudis are going to want one, the Egyptians are going to want one, and you already have a crackpot in North Korea who's firing nuclear weapons. He might aim at Alaska and hit Seattle, but we need to be worried about what's happening in the threat of nuclear weapons, and we need to be prepared for that, and that's why we've got to modernize our nuclear capability.
Mr. Williams?
You know, the spread of nuclear weapons is probably the most serious threat that we face today. The last thing we want to see is a terrorist group get a nuclear weapon in their hands. And you know, just a few years ago, everyone was saying that Iran is going to have a nuclear weapon in 1 year. The head of Israel came and talked to the Congress and said, Iran's going to have a nuclear weapon in 1 year. Well, the United States went and negotiated with Iran and got them to give up that nuclear capability, at least for 10 years. Now, Senator Thune sent a letter along with 47 other Republicans in the Senate saying to Iran, don't negotiate with us. You know, if I'd have done that as a young naval officer, I'd have been court-martialed, because it's best to negotiate with people and to get them to stop. Right now, Iran is not going to have a nuclear weapon for at least 10 years. And after 10 years of negotiating with us, 10 years of dealing with us, I think you'll find that Iran's going to be our friend, and they won't have a nuclear weapon.
Mr. Thune, we'll give you about a 30-second rebuttal on that.
That's right. He went after me. Look, this is a bad deal. We just gave $150 billion in sanctions relief to the world's leading state sponsor of terror. Iran is on the way to acquiring a nuclear capability. Make no mistake about it. And that was a bad deal. And the reason that the letter went to the mullahs is because the president didn't want to come to Congress. He went to the United Nations. Normally this would be handled as a treaty. This president wanted to circumvent Congress. He went to the United Nations to try and get their approval before consulting with the United States Congress.
Mr. Williams, we'll give you the last word on that.
You know, we gave Iran $150 billion of their money that we had used in sanctions to get them to come to the table and agree to this deal. It's not a bad deal. It would have been a bad deal if we wouldn't have had a deal. Then we would have been looking at an invasion and U.S. troops going in there and sons and daughters being killed. And that's not the way we should do things.
They're not going to be our friends.
What is your assessment of U.S. trade policy, specifically the North American Free Trade Agreement and the proposed Trans-Pacific Partnership? Mr. Thune.
Well, you know, look, trade is an important issue in South Dakota because we're an ag economy. It's our #1 industry. And as a member of the Senate Ag Committee, I deal with these issues on a regular basis, and I deal with the administration on a regular basis, dealing with trade relationships with places around the world where we're trying to open markets. And so, you know, trade deals that have been negotiated in the past, you can relitigate those, and maybe there were some bad deals negotiated in the past. But we need to make sure that going into the future, that when we negotiate these deals, that agriculture has a seat at the table. It is critically important to American agriculture and to South Dakota agriculture that we open up markets, increase our exports, and get these prices back at a better level for our farmers here in South Dakota. Now that means good deals negotiated on the front end, and then it means those deals have to be enforced. But we can't disengage from the global marketplace because it is too important to South Dakota's economy and it's too important to America's economy.
Mr. Williams.
You know, I agree with Senator Thune on this. I believe that the TPP is good for South Dakota, and it will allow us to export our agricultural goods. I think that's a good and a fine thing for us. You know, in general, I believe in free trade. We're becoming a global economy. We have to work together. You know, one of the things that's happened as a result of the trade policies we have in place today is that global extreme poverty has gone from 30% down to 10%. Now, that doesn't really affect us here in the United States, but as a people of the world, it's really a good thing. And so that's why I am in favor of free trade. The question I have is if President Obama went out and negotiated this TPP deal, and the Republicans control both houses of the Congress, why is it that it hasn't been approved? And I think the reason for it is because we have a dysfunctional Congress that won't get along. So I think that, you know, I'm for free trade. I think that with the negotiations by the Democratic president and the Republican Congress, it should have been approved.
It hasn't been sent to Congress yet.
Well, let's take a deeper look at agriculture.
By the
If you're
president.
generally in agreement on trade policy, What is right and what is wrong with other U.S. policies and regulations regarding agriculture, which is our state's largest industry? Mr. Thune.
Well, I think one thing that I would argue, and this would pertain to the Europeans and it would also pertain to Asia, and that's why we're trying to negotiate these agreements, is there are a lot of non-tariff barriers that are put in place. They'll put in place, barriers to products that are, or commodities that are raised in this country that use, for example, GMOs. Well, 90% of the crops in South Dakota, corn and soybeans, use GMO seeds. And there is nothing scientifically wrong with that. But we have countries around the world, in Europe, in Asia, who block American exports over that issue. And so that's just one example of what I would call a non-tariff barrier that's used to protect a local domestic industry in these countries. And I hope we can tear those down, and that's the purpose of the trade agreements. The trade agreements is to open markets for American producers and American businesses, because we already have the most open market in the world to other countries. So that's the purpose of all these trade agreements, is to tear those barriers down, give us access to those markets.
Mr. Williams.
And as you say, we are in general agreement about trade here, but we've had some things happen that have been kind of blamed on trade. One of them is country of origin labeling for our products. You know, we rescinded that. We don't have that anymore. And I think that's a real problem, especially for producers right here in South Dakota, because I think most people, when they go to the supermarket and they look at the beef, if they see that beef is origin from, say, Brazil or from South Dakota, they'll choose South Dakota. And they'll do that because they know when they buy beef from South Dakota, they know the kind of quality they're going to get. They don't know the kind of quality they're going to get in Brazil. Now, I don't mind Brazil selling their beef here. That's just fine. But I think consumers in the United States should be allowed to know the difference. And so those are the kind of things that we have to make sure our trade policies don't affect in a negative way. And once again, I'm for free trade, and I think that the more free trade we have, the better it'll be for our country and for the rest of the world.
Is global warming a real threat to our planet? Is it an uncontrollable act of nature, or do you think it could be addressed with environmental and energy practices? Mr. Thune.
Well, look, I think the climate is changing. It's changing all the time. It's been changing for probably thousands of years. And the question of whether or not human activity contributes to that, I don't know at what level, but I'll concede that at some level it does. There's a lot of disagreement in the scientific community about how much. But the question then becomes, what do we do about it, and at what cost? And in my view, the best way to get a change in behavior is to provide incentives to change behavior. And we have tried through a lot of the energy policies that I've been involved with in the Congress, renewable fuel standard, ethanol, wind energy, to move us in a direction where we're less dependent upon fossil fuels. What I don't think is the right approach is what the President has proposed, and that is a national energy tax, which would hit fixed income people in this country, seniors and families, with a huge energy tax, particularly here in the Midwest. The Public Utilities Commission has estimated it could increase electricity costs here in this region of the country by as much as 50%. That's not the right approach.
Mr. Williams.
Well, we have another disagreement here. Senator Thune believes that he does not sure what humans are doing to cause this global warming that we're seeing. That's you know, myself and virtually all the scientists in the world agree that we're doing something, and we're doing something that's really significant. You know, starting in 1900 to today, our atmosphere has warmed 1 degree centigrade, which may not sound like much, but it is a lot. At 3 degrees, it's not clear we can live on this planet anymore. And that's just continuing to go up. The last 3 months of September and August and July before it, the hottest months on record. And 2016 is going to be easily the hottest year ever. We have to do something about it. We have to do something now. And it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, because it's just going to be more expensive and harder to do. And so it's really great that President Obama is trying to address this issue. The worst thing we can do is say, let's just wait until it's such a terrible issue that we have to take draconian measures to fix it.
We're about halfway through this debate, and so we're going to reverse the order of the speaking order. And so we will let Mr. Williams answer first, and then Mr. Thune. Should construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline be allowed to proceed underneath the Missouri River? Do you foresee a peaceful resolution to the protests and the standoff now near the Standing Rock Indian Reservation. Mr. Williams.
Well, I surely foresee a peaceful resolution. I mean, I think that protest is a hallmark of the United States. And I think the Dakota Access Pipeline is an example of fossil fuel infrastructure that we really don't need to do. You know, we can move that fuel, move it by trucks or rail, and some people say that's more dangerous than moving it by pipeline. But I'll tell you, if you take a pipeline, you put it underneath the Missouri River, and there's a leak that they don't discover for, I don't know, months or years. It could be when the Missouri River is now flowing black that we realize there's a leak there. So I think the Dakota Access Pipeline is a bad idea, and I think we should stop construction of it and concentrate on infrastructure that will take us from fossil fuels to clean energy. I mean, that's the future of our country, and that's where we've got to be. Anything else, to me, appears to be folly. So that's my position on the Dakota Access Pipeline.
Mr. Thune.
The pipelines are safer than rail. They are safer than truck. They're the safest, cleanest, and most effective and efficient way to move those products. And we're not going to get rid of those products overnight. I'm all for moving us away from our reliance and dependence upon fossil fuels, but for the foreseeable future, we're going to need those. And the best way to move that stuff is through pipeline. And if you're going to bring a pipeline to this part of the country, you're probably going to have to go under a river. There are already 100 pipelines under the Missouri River. There are millions literally, of miles of pipelines in this country today. It is safer, more efficient, more cost-effective when you're moving those types of products. Now, with respect to what's happening up there, I hope they can resolve that peacefully. I talked to the head of the Office of Justice Services at the BIA a couple of days ago, and I hope that they can deal with this in a way where people are respectful of the right to protest, but also respectful of the laws in this land.
There are more than 500 federally recognized Indian tribes in the United States, including 9 in South Dakota. How do you assess the condition of Indian country, and what do you see as the federal government's proper role in dealing with these sovereign nations and their people? Mr. Williams.
Well, this is one of the major issues that faces us here in South Dakota. With our 9 tribes in Indian country, we have the 2 poorest counties in the United States right here in South Dakota. And that's not right. That's not the way it should be. And you know, the federal government has been trying to deal with this forever. I mean, since I was back in high school, they've been trying to deal with it. And they just haven't found a way to do it. And I think what we need is, we need to get rid of the traditional politicians, the career politicians that are running our Congress today, and put in guys like me who can bring new ideas and new ways to relate to our Native American population here in South Dakota. I mean, it makes up 9% of South Dakota. And I think that we need to take a new look. We need to go in and find leaders in the Native American population and then help them to find ways to find the kind of projects that they can get behind and champion for all the rest of us. Like, for instance, going from fossil fuels to clean energy.
Mr. Thune.
Well, the long-term solution, and by the way, I consult with the 9 tribes here in South Dakota multiple times every year. I have dozens of meetings with the tribal leaders and with members of the tribes out there. And the thing that's going to change the way of life on our reservations, improve the quality of life and the standard of living, is a private economy. We've got to get a private economy that creates jobs and allows people to create wealth. Right now, there isn't much of a private economy. There are a few businesses that do businesses on our reservations, but by and large, you're talking about an economy that's completely dependent upon the federal government. That doesn't work. In the meantime, honor our treaty obligations with health care, education. The best bridge, I think, to a better future for kids on our reservations is an education, and that's elementary, secondary, and then trying to get them into higher ed. And then I also think that, like I said before, we've got to make sure there's security. We have to have security. People need to be able to live in safety on our reservations, and there are elderly people and kids on the reservations today who are constantly living in fear.
What aspects of Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, should be retained and what should be scrapped? Mr. Williams.
Well, the Affordable Care Act is really a major milestone in the United States. You know, we've been trying since 1948 to get a national health care policy. And finally, with the passing of the Affordable Care Act, we did it. Now, does it need improvement? Well, the biggest room in the world is the room for improvement, according to my high school band instructor. So the Affordable Care Act certainly could be improved. But the worst thing we could do is repeal it and start over. That's not a way to do anything. I mean, the Affordable Care Act is using private health insurance to implement health care. And it's done a lot of great things. I mean, you can't be on your health insurance and get really sick and suddenly find out that at the end of it, you've lost your health insurance, or pre-existing conditions don't exist anymore. So it's done a lot of great things, but there are things that need to be done, and we could certainly do them. That's what we need to do. We need to work together to improve the Affordable Care Act instead of just saying, we want to repeal it, repeal it, repeal it. And I think that's one of the problems we have with our dysfunctional Congress.
Mr. Thune.
This is the problem with liberal economics. This is central planning by your federal government. We're going to define what insurance coverage is for the entire country, and it hasn't worked. There are still 30 million Americans without insurance. The goal of Obamacare 8 years ago was everybody gets covered. There are still 30 million Americans today without coverage, and there are more losing coverage because of Obamacare. Blue Cross Blue Shield just pulled out of the individual market in South Dakota. There are 8,000 people, and I talked to a bunch of them last week in Veblen who are losing their coverage. Bill Clinton has said that Obamacare has doubled premiums for people, halved their coverage. He said it's the craziest thing I've ever seen. And the liberal governor next door in Minnesota, Mark Dayton, said the Affordable Care Act is no longer affordable. This doesn't work, folks. And that's why we need to go to a different model. And that's why it needs to be repealed. And we need to put reforms in place that actually will drive down the cost and make insurance coverage in this country more accessible and more affordable to more people.
What is your stand on U.S. immigration policy, border security, enforcement, deportation, and amnesty? Mr. Williams.
And I'd just like to make a quick comment from the beginning about the Affordable Care Act. There's 15 million more Americans having health insurance than they did before. So it really is working, but it could work better, and just repealing is not an answer. Now, in terms of immigration, we are a country of immigrants. I mean, that's what makes us great. Not that we're homogeneous, but we're heterogeneous. We have people and religions and races and cultures from all over the world, and they join together to make the greatest country in the world has ever seen. So immigration is a good thing for us. Now, do we need to make sure that the immigrants who come here are not wishing us harm? Of course we do. But that's not where we're facing any issues. I mean, 9/11 was caused by people who weren't U.S. citizens, but they were here legally. But what we really have to worry about is the hate that is now being festered up in the United States. And that's what's a real danger to us. Just down in Kansas, just last week, a hate group was going to blow up an entire Somali community. That's a real problem. So immigration is a good thing for the United States.
Mr. Thune.
My grandfather and great uncle came here in 1906, and this country is a nation of immigrants. And we've been a welcoming nation, always have been a welcoming nation. I don't know about the hate that you're talking about, but I also know that people who come here need to follow the law. And that's why any discussion of immigration has to start with enforcement first. We can't talk about people who are here illegally until we convince the American people that we can secure the border. So it's securing the border, creating a biometric exit-entry program so that the people who are here on visas and have overstayed their visas so we can track them. And then we've got to make sure that we have a vetting system that for people, particularly as we talk about the refugee population coming in, that can certify that there aren't people there that are going to do us harm. But it's enforcement first. I know a lot of people here are employers. We want to have an E-Verify system in the workplace so that we know that the people who are here working in our economy are here legally. We're a nation of laws and we're a nation of immigrants. And we've got to figure out how to strike that balance, but you can't do that until you enforce the laws on the books first.
Well, let's take a deeper look at the whole issue of refugees, and refugees specifically from the Middle East, including those from Syria and those who are caught in the humanitarian crises around that region, including what we're seeing happen in Aleppo. We begin with Mr. Williams.
And will you repeat that question for me, Jack?
Certainly. I hope that wasn't too confusing. What about the acceptance of Middle Eastern refugees?
Well, I think we are a nation of immigrants, and refugees is a strong tradition of the United States. You know, in the 1956 Republican presidential platform of President Eisenhower, one of the planks was to do what we can to accept refugees. And I think we need to do that. You know, we don't need to be afraid of women and children, which is what most of these refugees are. And we already have a great vetting program for our refugees. We haven't had any refugees that I know of that have done any kind of terror attacks in the United States. So I think it's important that the United States does accept refugees and do what we can to help them. I mean, that is the very character of the United States, is to help those who are really in need. And refugees, these are people who are sitting in war zones and are being bombed, and they can't live in their homes anymore. You know, the United States is the place of last resort for them. And we should do what we can to help refugees. So I'm in favor of refugees, and I agree they should be vetted.
Mr. Thune.
We accept more refugees into the United States every year than all the other nations in the world combined. So we're doing what we are a welcoming nation, and we are trying to welcome people into this country. But we also have to make sure, in light of what's happening in the Middle East, and in light of what's happening in terms of radicalization of people in this country, that when people come here, and they come particularly from a region of the world where there is terrorist organizations operating and active, that we vet them carefully. The head of the DNI, Department of National Intelligence, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI director have testified in front of Congress that there are gaps in our system. They can't certify that when people come here that we have a vetting system that is going to ensure that there aren't people in that population that are going to do us harm. And so I just think what we need to do is make sure that they can certify that and that we're vetting people in a way that protects the American people from somebody who might want to come into this country and do us harm. And I think they're infiltrating the refugee population, if you're a terrorist organization, certainly would be something that would be high on your list.
As the cost of higher education has spiraled in the past decade, student loan debt in the United States has grown to $1.2 trillion. Should access to free public education extend beyond high school? And what, if anything, should the federal government do to address soaring student debt? Mr. Williams.
Well, I first want to attack soaring debt. You know, if Citibank or any of the large banks come and borrow money from the United States, they borrow it at a little under 1% interest. If a student goes who wants to go to college, he has to pay, I think it's 7%. So the first thing we can do is lower those interest rates for our college students today. Now, as far as free public education, that is another great American tradition. We've had free public education from K through 12 forever. And it's worked really well. And you know, we've had higher education be free tuition before too. California did it, and now I believe it's Kentucky is now starting to do it as well. So I think that a high school education isn't quite enough in today's job market. So I think it would be a good idea for us to consider free public education, at least in terms of tuition, to extend beyond high school. How far beyond? Well, 2 years seems reasonable to start, but maybe we would go to 4 years. But I think that's a really important thing for us to do. Education is what's going to drive our economy and drive our country into the future.
Mr. Thune.
Well, you want to make college education really expensive, make tuition free, because the costs will go up. You just wait and see. The interest rate on student loans, and this is as a result of legislation that we passed through Congress in the last couple of years, this last year is 3.76%. Now, I'm somebody who came up the hard way, and you asked earlier about characteristics of yourself. Part of mine's a work ethic, and I am somebody who appreciates work and effort and earning your way. And I think those are all things that are important about this country. And so, free college education strikes me as the wrong approach. Now, anybody who's willing to work hard deserves a possibility of a college education. And that's why we have to provide as many incentives out there as we possibly can. Affordable student loans. There are programs like the Perkins Loan Program, which I helped get reauthorized at the end of last year, that helps 4,000 low-income students in South Dakota get up to $5,500 a year toward their education. We need to strengthen those programs, but the idea that we ought to make it free to everybody, to me, I think it goes against what we are as a culture.
If and when you vote on a presidential nominee to the U.S. Supreme Court, what criteria will you use to reach your decision? Mr. Williams.
Well, First of all, if I'm elected to the United States Senate, I pledge to you that I will indeed provide the advice and consent that the Constitution requires. I won't say we'll wait till the next election, as our current Congress has done, our current Senate has done. And when I look at a U.S. Supreme Court justice, what I'm looking for is a man who is a fair-minded person. You know, I don't think litmus tests are a good way to go for a Supreme Court nominee. First of all, you can't enforce them. I mean, once they're on the court, they're on the court for life. So you can't enforce litmus tests, but you can look at a jurist and say, is he a fair man? Does he listen to the arguments? You know, what are the decisions that he has rendered? And do those decisions make sense? So that's what I would look for in a Supreme Court justice, no matter whether it came from a Republican president or a Democratic president. But I do pledge that I will always give them a hearing, and that's what hasn't happened to Merrick Garland, President Obama's appointment to replace Justice Scalia.
Mr. Thune.
Look, I think that when it comes to the Supreme Court, it's important that we have people that are constitutionalists. I mean, I want to see people nominated to the Supreme Court who are going to exercise judicial restraint. I don't want judges on the Supreme Court that are there to accomplish some agenda or legislate from the bench because they haven't been able to get something through Congress. And activist judges, I think, are dangerous to this country. And so I want to see somebody that will exercise judicial restraint, that will be a constitutionalist, and someone who will worry about enforcing the Constitution and the laws of this country and not become somebody who is trying to use the court as a way to legislate some agenda.
The right to bear arms is guaranteed by the Second Amendment. What, if any, limitations should be placed on the ownership and possession of weapons and ammunition? Mr. Williams.
Well, I am a big believer in the Second Amendment. I think that Americans do have the right to bear and own arms, and so I'm for that. But we're not allowed to own anything we want. You can't own Stinger missiles. Since 1934, if you wanted to own a machine gun, you had to pay a fairly large tax, and you had to register them. So some kinds of weapons we need to keep track of. We can't just leave it wide open. Unfortunately, that is the position of the NRA. And the NRA has a stranglehold on our Congress because they don't even want to limit the kind of bullets that will pierce the Kevlar vests of our police. So I believe that there are things we can do, technology things we can do to make guns safer. There's 33,000 Americans killed with guns every year. And with a little bit of technology, we could maybe cut that in half. So I believe guns need to be regulated in the sense that we can use technology to make them safer. Keeping them out of the hands of the mentally ill, that's all very, very well and good, but we can't stop them from stealing a gun and using it unless we use technology.
Mr. Thune.
There are way too many people in this country that are lost to gun violence. Of those 33,000, 2/3 of those are suicides. It's still way too many. We have to make sure that we're doing everything we can as a culture to address the fundamental problem. And Jay mentioned mental health. That is something on which there is agreement. Many of these cases of mass violence are mentally deranged people. And I think that's where there's common ground. You're not going to find common ground on more restrictions. I mean, there are a few areas where I think, for example, that nobody that's a suspected terrorist, anybody that's on a watch list or a no-fly list shouldn't be able to buy a handgun without the FBI having some say-so about it. But there are things that we can do in the area of mental health, and that's where we really ought to focus. And because I think this is a Second Amendment right. It is guaranteed under our Constitution, and people in this country have that right to defend themselves, and we shouldn't trifle with it. But we need to make sure that we're doing everything we can to address what I think is the fundamental problem, and that's mental health.
The First Amendment protects freedom of expression. Is the Bill of Rights too permissive in allowing what some people consider to be offensive, hateful speech and unpatriotic forms of protest, such as flag burning? Mr. Williams.
I do not believe the Bill of Rights is too permissive. I believe the Bill of Rights is a fundamental part of America, once again, and I believe that those fundamental rights have to exist, and one of those things is the right to protest. So even though it may not be likable to me, like I don't like to see somebody burning a flag, but I do believe they have the right to do that kind of thing. That's our whole country is based on the freedoms that we get from the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. You know, the Second Amendment, I agree with that, and the First Amendment, I agree with that even more. I mean, the First Amendment gives us the free press that we have. I mean, the idea of trying to sue journalists for doing their jobs for libel and that kind of thing, I'm against that. I think that freedom is what we're all about, and the First Amendment lists the first of our basic freedoms. Of course, you don't have unlimited freedom to yell fire in the crowded theater, but you do have the right to do peaceful protest.
Mr. Thune.
And I think that that is what another amazing thing about our country. The First Amendment, the right of speech, the right of expression, free press. I mean, those are things that make America the model and the envy of the world when it comes to our democracy. And so, yeah, I mean, I think we need to make sure that people protest in a nonviolent, peaceful way. We need to make sure that law enforcement respects the right of people to protest. Those are both things that we need to ensure are happening in this country. And but there are some things. I mean, for example, flag burning. I mean, I've worked with the VFW. I've worked with the American Legion in this state 4 years on an amendment to the Constitution that would ban flag burning. Now, it would take an amendment to the Constitution. I realize that's going to be very hard to make happen. But that is something that is so sacred to the people who have defended our country and our freedoms that's an area that I think actually could be a restriction.
Both of you have been vocal critics of Donald Trump. Yet, John Thune, you have said that you will still vote for Mr. Trump. Jay Williams, you have been a consistent, enthusiastic supporter of Secretary Clinton. How does your choice align with your values, your policy positions, and your vision for the country? Mr. Williams.
Well, I believe Secretary Clinton is a principled person. She spent her entire adult life working for women and children. You know, she was a senator from New York State. Senator Thune even worked with her in the Senate. She's been a Secretary of State under President Obama. She's worked for others all her life. Now, there's been 7 or 8 investigations of the Benghazi tragedy. There were 2 of 9/11. And the reason for that is because the partisan House of Representatives has spent millions of dollars and who knows how many man-hours investigating Secretary Clinton, trying to vilify her. And after all those investigations, they found nothing. You know, Senator Thune said in a previous debate that FBI Director Comey said that his underlings had all recommended they indict him. Quite the opposite is true. The FBI investigated Secretary Clinton and found that she did no wrong. So there's been a lot of vilification of Secretary Clinton. I support her because I believe she's a principled woman, and she's not Donald Trump.
Well, I didn't say they all recommended it. I said there was reporting that there were people, career investigators at the FBI who disagreed with that decision. But the point is, Hillary Clinton, whether you think she's a role model or not, did destroy 33,000 emails after they had been subpoenaed. How many people in this room could get away with defying a subpoena to keep those emails? She literally took a hammer to 2 of her BlackBerries and crushed them. She was described by FBI Director Comey as extremely careless with classified information, and that no other normal person would do the things that she did. She has repeatedly lied to the American people about that, over and over again. So these are 2 flawed candidates, folks. There's nobody here who's going to win a character contest. It really comes down to whose policies will be best for South Dakota. And on that issue, there's no, in my mind, Hillary Clinton would be terrible for South Dakota when it comes to her economic policies, when it comes to judges that she would put on the court, but these are the choices that we're left with.
These are divisive times in our nation. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the future of these United States? And regardless of the outcome of the presidential election and for the greater good, are you hopeful that the polarized American electorate will accept and unite behind the new president? Mr. Williams.
Well, as you probably can tell, I am an optimist. So I am certainly optimistic about the United States of America, which I love and I think is the greatest country in the world. So I'm surely optimistic. Now, there is a lot of polarization, and I think that is the crux of the problem, that our Congress is populated entirely with career politicians. And, you know, that's what I'm not. I am the opposite of that. I've never been elected to a political office, but I am here offering myself to go to Washington and to try to change that gridlock that exists there. So I think that's the problem when we polarize, and it's both sides, the way we say it's my way or no way, and that's not a good thing. I am not beholden to a political party. I'm not beholden to special interest groups or to large donors. I'm beholden to the voters of South Dakota. And I think that if we can elect representatives like me, we can address these problems and we can make the United States better than it even is now, in spite of the fact that it's the greatest country in the world. Unfortunately, the Republican presidential nominee doesn't agree with any of that.
Mr. Thune.
Well, I'm very bullish on the country. We are a great country made up of great people. And with the right policies, we can be even better and greater. And I hope that when this election is all said and done, and the smoke clears and the dust settles, that we can sit down and work together. And I will do that. I have done that in my entire time in office. I've stood up to presidents who I thought were trying to do things that were bad for South Dakota. I've worked with presidents when I felt like they were doing things that were good for South Dakota. And that's what we need more of. We need people who are willing to build bridges and build relationships and get results. My whole career has been built around getting results for the people of South Dakota. I chair a committee called the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee, which has jurisdiction over planes, trains, automobiles, the internet technology. The ranking Democrat on my committee, Bill Nelson, joined me last week in Rapid City. We visited the underground lab out there. We worked together to pass numerous bills through Congress this last year. And it's because of the approach that we bring. I think the Commerce Committee could be a model for a lot of the other committees in the Congress. But the fact of the matter is the challenges are too great. We have to work together for the good of the American people. I will do that. I always have. I always put South Dakota first.
We end this forum with 2-minute closing statements. In the past hour, we have discussed 24 different subjects. Based on what you have expressed and what you have heard your opponent express, why should the voters of South Dakota elect you to serve in the United States Senate? Mr. Williams.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Jack, and the Rotary Club here, and Senator Thune as well, for this spirited debate, I would say. I'm a fourth-generation South Dakotan, raised on a farm up in north central South Dakota. I'm a U.S. Navy veteran with service in a Vietnam War. As a Navy pilot, I served in Europe and in the U.S. I'm a veteran of the Peace Corps. I served in South America after volunteering for the Peace Corps. I have a BA degree from the University of Wisconsin and a Master of Science degree in Computer Science from Northern Illinois University. As a high-tech software engineer, I worked for Texas Instruments down in Dallas, Texas, and then for 2 different high-tech software companies out in the Silicon Valley of California during the height of the computer revolution. 30 years ago, my wife Carol and I and our 3 children moved back to South Dakota to start a high-tech business right here. And so for the last 30 years, I've been operating that business and serving my community in various ways. On the school board, I was actually president of our Rotary Club down there. So I know about Rotary, and I do love Rotary. And I think that those traits, as you can tell from my experience, I am not a career politician. I'm quite the opposite. And I have a lot of background. So almost everybody who I meet, I can find something in common with. And I think that is the trait that will allow me, if elected, to go to Washington, to work with other people, and to get things done. It's a real problem we have right now with this polarization in our country. And I'm not beholden to the Democratic Party, certainly not to the Republican Party. But, in the 1990s, I was a Republican. So I'm the kind of guy who works with lots of different ideas and thoughts. And I can work with people and work together. And I think that's why November 8th, you should vote for me. And if you're early voting, vote for me as well. And I appreciate the opportunity. And I look forward to another debate with Senator Thune tonight on KSFY television. Thanks again.
Mr. Thune.
Thanks, Jack. Thank you, Rotarians. Thanks, Jay, for the opportunity to discuss the issues. Every election, in my opinion, is about the future. Now, some of you heard I just had a granddaughter about 5 weeks ago. And it makes you even more keenly aware of the things that we do, the decisions that we make, and what they're going to do to shape the future that those kids and those grandkids are going to live in. And elections are also about differences. And we have some very stark differences in how we approach issues. But the one thing I will tell you is that we have big challenges facing this country. On the economic front, the domestic front, national security. We're going to need a strong voice in Washington, D.C. And I have proven in the time that I've been in office that I'm somebody who knows how to get things done. As I mentioned, I chair the Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee in the Congress and in the Senate. I serve on the Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over health care, taxes, trade, Social Security, and I serve on the Ag Committee, our state's #1 industry. I've worked on all those committees to put policies and legislation in place that are good for South Dakota. And we've seen a lot of success. In this polarized, toxic environment that everybody talks about, when you get past all the cable news anchors shouting each other, we've chalked up wins for South Dakota. We passed the first long-term highway bill in a decade. We passed the first freight rail reforms in 2 decades. We passed aviation security reforms for the first time in 8 years. We passed a pipeline safety bill. We passed technology bills, all out of the Commerce Committee, all reported to the floor of the United States Senate, all passed the House, sent to the President, signed into law. We're getting results for the people of South Dakota, but there's a lot more to do. This economy is sputtering, it's stagnant. We need faster growth, better paying jobs in our economy. We do things well here in South Dakota, and thankfully to a lot of the people in this room, we need to take that same kind of common sense to Washington, D.C. and get this country moving in a different direction. I'm asking for your vote on November the 8th. Thank you.
For their commitment and desire to serve our state and our nation, please join me in thanking the candidates, Republican U.S. Senator John Thune and Democratic U.S. Senate candidate Jay Williams.